It's funny, isn't it? Max Scheler, a name that was once like right up there with the giants of early 20th century thought. But for many philosophers today, well, he's maybe more cited than truly deeply grappled with.
Yeah, kind of a curious shift, right? I mean, here's this mind just bursting with innovative ideas across ethics, phenomenology, you name it. But his work isn't always at the forefront of the philosophical conversation.
Exactly. And that, to us, makes him, well, ripe for rediscovery. So today, we're taking a deep dive, a real deep dive, into the philosophy of Max Scheler.
A thinker who really wrestled with some huge questions about human existence, our value systems, how we're all connected. And honestly, his insights are still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely. And for you, our listeners, those with that philosophical itch, that desire to really delve into these complex ideas, but maybe without getting bogged down in jargon.
Well, this deep dive is especially for you. We've gathered a whole range of sources to give you a complete picture of Scheller's intellectual journey and his core ideas.
Think of it as a focused exploration, really designed to provide you with, well, some serious intellectual nourishment.
Exactly. So, over the next little while, we're going to be getting to the heart of Scheller's philosophy. We'll trace how his life experiences shaped his unique approach. We'll dig into his take on phenomenology, which took some really fascinating turns from Husserl's ideas. And then there's his influential theory of value personalism.
His insights on community and solidarity, his work on the phenomenology of religious experience, really groundbreaking stuff. And finally, his later contributions to philosophical anthropology and metaphysics, which, to be honest, aren't as well known, but just as important.
Absolutely. So our mission here is to distill the most insightful bits of his thought, those aha moments, so you can really appreciate his lasting significance for philosophy.
Exactly. So let's start by looking at the man himself.
Okay, so to understand where Scheller's philosophy went, it really helps to understand the key moments and influences in his life.
Right, the context.
Exactly. He was born in Munich, 1874, into an Orthodox Jewish family. And early on, he was exposed to this rich intellectual environment.
Oh, yeah, his family background.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In his younger years, he was super into Nietzsche. And he even, for a time, identified as a social democrat, even a Marxist.
Wow. That's a bit of a surprise.
It is, right. He started university in Munich and Berlin, actually drawn to medicine first, but then he shifted his focus to philosophy and sociology, studying with some big names like Dilthey and Simmel.
So, broad range of influences right from the start.
Definitely. But then his move to Jena was really significant. That's where he connected with Rudolf Eucken.
Eucken?
Yeah, and a Nobel laureate, super influential back then. His focus on the inner spiritual life, it really seems to have resonated with Scheler. Jena was a key period for him. He finished his dissertation and his habilitation there, really marking the start of his academic career. And on a trip to Heidelberg, he met Max Weber.
Another huge figure, whose work, of course, would intersect with Scheller's later on.
Exactly. So you see this initial breadth of Scheller's engagement with all these different intellectual traditions, and it's really important for understanding his later turn towards phenomenology.
Right, like all these threads coming together.
Yeah, and you see how Nietzsche's focus on the individual, Marx's social critique, Dilthey's emphasis on lived experience, Simmel's sociological lens, and Eucken's spiritual concerns, all of these kind of fed into the unique questions Scheler would bring to phenomenology.
Fascinating. So the seeds were already being sown, so to speak.
They were. And then there's this pivotal moment. 1901, he meets Edmund Husserl.
The father of phenomenology.
Right. And reading Husserl's logical investigations in 1902, well, that proved to be a turning point. It led Scheler to dedicate himself to developing phenomenological ideas. He also, by the way, played a big role in introducing Henri Bergson's work to German philosophers.
Bergson with his focus on intuition and lived duration.
Yeah, exactly. So Scheler was enriching the intellectual landscape, bringing in new perspectives.
Okay, so that leads us to the Munich phenomenologists. Now, this group, for anyone interested in how phenomenology developed, is super important.
It really is. So Scheler moved his family to Munich in 1906, and there, with Theodor Lipps, he established this circle. The first members were mostly students of Lipps, including some big names like Alexander Fender and Moritz Geiger.
Fender.
Yeah, important figure. And later, the circle grew to include thinkers like Dietrich von Hildebrand and Edith Stein.
Wow, so Munich became a real hub for phenomenology.
It did. And this highlights Scheller's early role, not just as a philosopher, but as someone who brought people together,
A facilitator, a networker.
Exactly. He brought the community together. But then Scheller's academic career hit a snag. Well, actually more than a snag, some pretty serious
Oh,
controversies.
yeah, his personal life wasn't exactly conventional.
Mm,
And for a philosopher, well, this raises some interesting questions about the connection between their personal life and their work.
it does. So Scheller separated from his first wife and had some relationships that caused a stir.
And this led to him losing his teaching privileges.
Right. So from 1910 to 1919, he had to make a living as a private scholar, a lecturer, or a writer.
Tough time, I imagine.
It must have been. But even with the financial strain, this decade was amazingly productive for him intellectually.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He published some major works during this time, like Phenomenology and Theory of the Feeling of Sympathy and of Love and Hate, and the two-part Formalism in Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Value.
Wow, that's his most important work on ethics, right?
It is. And he also wrote The Genius of War and the German War during this period. We'll get to that one later.
Yeah.
But the point is, sometimes those periods of difficulty in your personal life can actually spark intellectual breakthroughs.
Interesting. So, even though he was basically shut out of academia for a while, he ended up connecting with the Göttingen circle of phenomenology. And this, for anyone studying the history of phenomenology, is a big deal.
Huge. So this circle, centered around Husserl, included brilliant thinkers like Adolf Reinach, Hedwig Martius, Roman Ingarden, Edith Stein. And Scheler, even though he couldn't hold a university position, was invited to give lectures in Göttingen starting in 1912.
Lectures. So he was still very much a part of the intellectual scene.
Oh, yeah. And get this. Because he was banned from universities, these lectures often happened in kind of unusual places, like hotel rooms.
Hotel rooms.
Yeah. His friend Dietrich von Wildebrand would arrange them. And it was also during this time that he became a co-editor of the super influential journal Jahrbuch für Philosophie und Phänomenologische Forschung.
Wow, so his standing in the phenomenological movement, it didn't diminish at all.
Not one bit. In fact, this period really solidified it, and it allowed for a lot of, cross-pollination of ideas among these key figures.
Okay, so after all this time outside formal academia, he eventually made his way back to a more traditional setting. Cologne, right?
That's right, 1918. Konrad Adenauer, who would later become, super famous.
Yeah, the first chancellor of West Germany.
Exactly. So Adenauer invited him to join this new research institute for the social sciences in Cologne. Specifically, he wanted Scheler to be like this prominent Catholic voice.
Interesting. So Scheler officially joined in 1919, back to university life.
Yeah. And it was during his time in Cologne that he wrote his major work on the philosophy of religion, on the eternal in man. It reflects this renewed focus on religion, but within his phenomenological framework.
Okay, so he wasn't just moving in philosophical circles, was he? His network sounds incredibly broad, like spanning a ton of disciplines and even the arts.
Oh, incredibly so. Throughout his time in Berlin and Cologne, he was constantly in touch with leading German intellectuals, from philosophers and theologians to scientists. I mean, thinkers like Martin Buber, Ernst Troeltsch, Albert Einstein, Paul Tillich, they were all part of his circle.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. He also corresponded with psychologists, natural scientists, musicians, poets like Rainer Maria Rilke.
Rilke, the poet of existential longing.
Exactly. And artists like Otto Dix, who was a close friend in Cologne.
So this huge range of influences fed into his work.
It did. His book, The Forms of Knowledge and Society, for example, is considered a foundational text in the sociology of knowledge, and it shows this deep engagement with American pragmatism. At the same time, he was working on all these manuscripts covering philosophical anthropology, metaphysics, politics, history. He was also lecturing a lot and dedicating a lot of energy to fighting the rise of fascism. A busy guy.
Yeah, sounds like it. But his time in Cologne wasn't without its challenges, right? More personal difficulties and growing intellectual disagreements, especially with the Catholic Church.
That's right. His divorce from his second wife and his marriage to his third, that created more tension with the whole Catholic philosopher role at the university.
And beyond the personal, he was becoming more critical of what he saw as the church's, conservatism and its political stance in the post-war era.
Exactly. And he really wanted to make it clear that his work wasn't just religious, it was fundamentally philosophical.
So this tension eventually led him to accept a professorship in Frankfurt in 1927.
Yeah, and he was excited to connect with the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, folks like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. But sadly, his health declined rapidly. He was a heavy smoker, and he died in Frankfurt in May 1928, only 53.
A life cut way too short. So
Mhm.
a life full of intense intellectual activity, personal struggles, and this huge range of influences. It all seems to have shaped his philosophical development.
Definitely. His religious upbringing, his engagement with so many different intellectual currents, his personal battles, it all played a role in the questions he asked and the answers he sought. And this leads us directly to how he understood the nature of philosophy itself and his unique engagement with phenomenology.
Okay, so for Scheler, what was the big question, the driving force behind all his philosophical work?
Well, towards the end of his life, Scheler said that the fundamental issue behind all his thinking was the question of the meaning of the human being.
The meaning of the human being.
Yeah, and it wasn't just one topic among many. It was like the unifying thread of everything he
It
did.
was everything.
Yeah. Like many of the philosophers of life who influenced him, he was really concerned with rescuing philosophy from what he saw as the limitations of science.
Okay, limitations.
The tendency to reduce humans to just homo faber, tool makers obsessed with manipulating the world, you know.
Could control and use, yeah.
Exactly. While he recognized that, sure, we have practical abilities, Scheler insisted that we're capable of so much more. He thought we can grasp the world in its essential being, its value.
So a much richer view of human potential.
Exactly. And this is crucial for how he saw philosophy. He insisted that it had to address the whole of human experience, not just the stuff that can be empirically verified.
Okay, so not just about building logical systems or solving abstract puzzles.
Well, for Scheler, philosophy was, and I quote, the loving act of participation by the core of the human being in the essence of all things.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
Right. He actually distinguished three main types of knowledge: practical knowledge, driven by necessity, avoiding mistakes. Then there's erudition, Bildungswissen, which is motivated by wonder, a desire to understand.
Okay, wonder.
Yeah, and then there's knowledge from revelation, coming from awe and the encounter with the sacred. And he placed philosophy squarely in that realm of erudition.
So wonder is where philosophy begins. That's an idea that goes back to the ancient Greeks, but Scheler gave it his own spin, didn't he?
He did. For Scheler, wonder isn't just passive curiosity, it's this loving concern for the world as it truly is. And he differentiated it from the classical idea of eros.
Okay, eros.
Yeah, which he thought was often rooted in a sense of lack or incompleteness. Instead, he linked philosophical wonder to the Christian concept of agape.
Agape, selfless, giving love.
Exactly. So the philosopher, according to Scheler, approaches the world with humility, with reverence, recognizing the world's incredible depth, the mystery of being. And that's a very different starting point compared to approaches that see philosophy as mainly about mastering knowledge.
Yeah, totally different.
Right. So knowledge itself, for Scheler, isn't about constructing a mental picture of the world, a representation. It's something more fundamental.
More like a direct engagement with reality.
Exactly. He saw knowledge as an ontological relation, a science for Helmholtz, a way for a being to participate in the being of another. He actually criticized neo-Kantian idealism, which emphasized the way the subject constructs experience. He said, no, discovery comes first.
Openness to what's given, what's outside of ourselves.
Right. So knowing becomes a way of participating in being, not just imposing our categories on it.
And he placed so much emphasis on the role of our emotions, our feelings in knowing, didn't he? It wasn't just about the intellect.
Absolutely. Like Augustine, he saw the emotional and affective life as the basis of all knowledge. He argued that love, in its various forms, is what opens us up to the world, to the reality of what's other than ourselves.
Love is the key to knowledge.
Exactly. And this led him to this pretty radical claim that there's a moral precondition for knowledge.
Okay, moral precondition.
Yeah, he said that only a loving being can truly know. And he saw this love as a movement towards transcendence.
Okay, transcendent.
Always reaching beyond the self, towards greater meaning, ultimately directed towards the infinite, towards absolute value and being. That's why he said, and I love this quote, knowledge is ultimately from the divine and for the divine.
Wow. Emphasizing that deep connection between knowledge and the divine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so how did Husserl's phenomenology, with its focus on bracketing and intentionality, how did that fit into this loving approach for Scheler? Did he see it as a method?
So Scheler was deeply influenced by Husserl, that's for sure. But his understanding of phenomenology, it took some different paths. For Scheler, it wasn't primarily a method, but more like a fundamental attitude.
An attitude.
Yeah, a way of being in the world. And it involved suspending our everyday assumptions, the scientific worldview. But the motivation for this suspension wasn't like cold detachment, it was love.
Love.
Yeah. a deep love and reverence for the world, letting its essence reveal itself without our preconceptions getting in the way. He even compared this phenomenological attitude to some Buddhist practices of mindfulness.
Oh, wow. Interesting connection.
Right. And he was aligned with the realist phenomenologists on a key point, the idea of Wesenssalen.
Essential intuitions. And this is a big debate within phenomenology, right?
It is. Like Adolf Ranach and others, Scheler believed we can have these direct graspings of the essence of things. But these insights, he said, are always partial, never complete. He felt that a big problem with modern thought was this distrust of the world. Like, we suspect that what we experience isn't real, just a mental construction.
Yeah, skepticism about the world.
Yeah, exactly. But phenomenology, for Scheler, it was a corrective to this skepticism. It was about trust. Trust in the world and trust in experience, believing that the world offers itself to us, invites us to participate in its meaning. And the phenomenological attitude is an expression of this trust, a commitment to describing things exactly as they appear to our consciousness.
Okay, so for Scheler, philosophy is fueled by love and reverence, and phenomenology is the way we open ourselves to the world's fullness. That's a very different starting point from many other philosophical traditions. Now, let's dive into his ethical theory value personalism. And this is where his critique of Kant's formalism comes in, right?
It does. His major work on this, Formalism in Ethics and Non-Formal Ethics of Value, is partly a response to Kant. Scheler agreed with Kant that ethics shouldn't be based on utilitarianism or happiness.
Right, not just about consequences or feelings.
Exactly. He agreed that ethical obligation is a priori, independent of those things. But he thought Kant's categorical imperative, well, it was too abstract.
Too detached from real-life moral experience.
Yeah. He argued that it didn't account for the specific obligations we have to individuals.
The uniqueness of each moral situation.
Exactly. It's not just about a universal rule. It's about what I ought to do in this particular situation.
So very personal.
Yeah. So instead of a purely formal principle, like the categorical imperative, Scheler proposed this material or non-formal a priori that comes from our direct experience of values.
Okay, so what does that mean, material a priori?
He argued that every experience has values built into it. We don't just see neutral objects. We experience them as beautiful, courageous, useful, all kinds of values.
The world is full of values.
Exactly. So for Scheler, objects are bearers of values. But he said that value isn't a property of the object itself, like its size or shape. It's given in the act of valuing, kind of like how color is given in the act of seeing.
We perceive the value.
Right. And he called this valueception, this direct, intuitive grasp of value. And he considered this our most basic way of relating to the world.
Even more basic than our senses or our intellect.
Yeah, exactly. So ethics, for Scheler, is rooted in how we feel about the world, not just how we think about it.
Okay, that's interesting. And do these values, as we experience them, tell us what ought to be?
Yes. Building on Franz Brentano, Schiller saw positive values as inherently connected to being itself. So it's not just that we find them agreeable, they present themselves to us as things that should be realized. And negative values, well, those are things that shouldn't be.
We feel it directly.
Exactly. In this direct link between values and existence, the ought is given right there in our experience. Not through logic, but through feeling.
Okay, so values aren't just subjective preferences. They have this inherent ethical dimension.
Right. They point us toward what is good, what is right.
And the act of valuing, it's not passive. We don't just absorb values. We actively participate in creating them.
You got it. Valuing is an intentional act. It's about giving meaning. And it's an emotional act rooted in what Scheler called the heart.
The heart.
Yeah, by heart he meant the fundamental emotional acts of love and hate. And for him, these underpin all valueception.
Okay, love and hate is the foundation.
Exactly. He described them not just as feelings, but as dynamic forces. Love deepens our appreciation of value, shows us the potential of something.
And hate diminishes value.
Right. These acts of love and hate are how the world gets meaning for us in the first place. And built into this process is preferencing. We're drawn to what has more positive value, repelled by what has less.
We naturally rank things.
We do. And this leads to his idea of an individual ethos and his concept of an objective hierarchy of values.
Okay, objective hierarchy.
That sounds tricky. How did he justify that?
So Scheler argued that every experience of value includes a ranking, a preference for some values over others, and through our acts of valuing, we each develop our own unique order of values, our ethos.
Right, our personal value system.
Yeah. But then he went further and said there's also an objective hierarchy of values ranging from lower or more superficial to higher. or deeper.
An objective hierarchy.
Yeah. And from lowest to highest, this ranking goes: pleasure, utility, vitality, culture, and holiness. And he said we grasp this ranking intuitively. We feel it.
We feel it, yeah, through things like how long the feeling lasts, how deep the fulfillment is. And this objective order, he called it the ordre du cœur, borrowing from Pascal, means that we ought to prefer higher values to lower ones. It's a moral imperative.
Okay, so we have a responsibility to act in ways that align with those higher values.
Exactly.
Now, where do persons fit into all of this? What makes a person ethically significant in Scheller's view?
So both the ability to experience value and to grasp this objective hierarchy, those are unique to persons.
Persons are the valuers.
They are. And Scheller's using the term person partly in dialogue with Kant. He wanted to keep Kant's idea that the person has absolute value is an end in itself, but he wanted to ground that value differently.
Not just in reason, but in something else.
Right. So he described the person as the concrete unity of all their acts of perceiving, feeling, willing.
The person is more than just their individual acts.
Exactly. And he talked about the unity, referring to the unique style of each person, how they love, how they give meaning to the world. So each person has their own unique perspective on reality.
That when a person dies, it's not just a biological event.
Right. It's the loss of that unique perspective, that way of encountering and valuing the world.
So a person isn't just a thing, an object. This is very much in line with phenomenology, right?
It is. So this unity of acts, this act center, it can't be objectified. Objects get their meaning through our acts, and persons are the ones performing those acts.
So a person is defined by how they act, how they value.
Exactly. It's not about some fixed set of properties. And Scheler was careful to distinguish his idea of the person from traditional concepts like subject, ego, mind. He saw those as trying to pin down something that's fundamentally dynamic.
Always in motion, always changing.
Yeah. So he said the essence of a person, you can't capture it in a definition. You can only grasp it through value insight.
Value insight.
Yeah, it's an immediate, direct understanding of the other as a person. And it happens through love.
Love is how we truly see the other person.
Exactly. We are most fully ourselves as persons when we love and are loved.
Okay, that's a really powerful idea. And this understanding of personhood connects directly to his view of ethical responsibility, right?
Absolutely. Because we're the ones who experience value and grasp that objective hierarchy. We're the ones who are ethically responsible.
Makes sense.
And remember, all experience is value latent. So we have this fundamental responsibility to respond to everything we encounter in a way that honors its highest value, to love it fully. And when it comes to other persons, well, this means we have to see their inherent worth, love them more and more deeply.
And failing to do so is a kind of moral failing.
It is. Any act that reduces a person's value, treating them just as a means to an end, is wrong. And for Scheler, the good isn't a static thing. It's a movement. It's about constantly opening ourselves to those higher values. And the experience of positive values, it calls us to love others more profoundly.
And negative values call us to overcome hate and work towards the good.
Exactly. And this call to action, it's not a general rule. It's a personal calling. It's unique to each of us.
So ethics is about self-discovery and growth as we figure out our role in the world of values.
Beautifully put.
Now, moving beyond the individual, Scheler also had some fascinating ideas about our relationships with others, the nature of community, and the concept of solidarity.
Yeah, and it's interesting, he didn't approach it from the usual starting point, the problem of the other.
Right. How do we bridge the gap between ourselves and others?
Yeah, he actually rejected that whole framework. He said, we don't begin as isolated individuals. Instead, our awareness of ourselves as persons always happens within the context of community. He called it experiencing with one another, miteinander erleben.
So we're already connected from the start.
Exactly. And he thought philosophies that start with the problem of the other, well, they're taking this communal background for granted. So for Scheler, the real task was to examine the experiences that make up this shared reality.
And his investigation started with our feelings, our emotions, not our intellect.
That's right. He believed our affective life is more fundamental than our rational capacities. And in our experience of other persons, there's this basic emotional understanding that comes before any intellectual grasp.
We feel them before we think about them.
Exactly. And his book, The Nature of Sympathy, goes deep into this.
The nature of sympathy.
Yeah, really important work. He wanted to show that genuine ethics can't be based solely on shared feelings. It needs this deeper orientation of love towards the other.
Love as the foundation of ethics.
Exactly. So he analyzed all these different kinds of co-feelings, as he called them, to show how complex our emotional engagement with others really is.
And he made some key distinctions between these co-feelings, right?
Yeah, for example, he talked about feeling with one another, minnenunderfühlen. That's when we experience the same emotion together, like shared joy or grief.
Okay, feeling the same thing.
Right. Then there's vicarious feeling, nachfühlen. This is about grasping another person's feeling from a distance. Not necessarily feeling it yourself, but understanding it.
Kind of like the basis for empathy.
Exactly. And then there's fellow feeling, mitgefühl, what we usually call sympathy or pity, feeling for someone else, caring about their well-being.
And this often motivates us to help.
It does. And then he looked at psychic contagion, Gefühlensteckung. That's when you get swept up in a group emotion, lose your sense of self, like in a crowd or, more dangerously, in a mob.
Right, losing yourself in the group.
Yeah. And finally, he talked about identification, Einsfühling. This is a stronger form of contagion where the lines between I and other blur, like in some mystical experiences.
Wow, so many layers to our emotional connections.
There are, and the point of all these distinctions is to show that just sharing a feeling isn't the same as genuine ethical concern.
So we can feel connected to others without necessarily acting ethically towards them.
Right.
And these co-feelings, they mostly happen involuntarily, don't they? They point to this deeper interconnectedness we have as humans.
Exactly. He said they reveal our natural inclination to participate in the lives of others. Even things like, getting confused about who came up with an idea in a group, that's subtle evidence of this deep connection we have.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to his ideas about the collective person and the different forms of community.
Right. Building on those ideas from the nature of sympathy, Scheler developed his concept of the collective person, Gesamtperson, in his book Formalism and Ethics. Remember how he saw individuals as act centers?
Yeah, unified in their intentional acts.
Right. Well, collective person refers to a different kind of unity, the unity of social acts.
Okay, social act.
Yeah, acts that are directed towards others, like making a promise. Those only make sense in relation to other people.
They depend on others.
Exactly. And he contrasted these with singularizing acts, which are focused on oneself. So for Scheler, we're both individuals and members of communities.
Both at the same time.
Exactly. And he outlined 4 main types of social groups. First, there's the herd or mass. This is characterized by that psychic contagion, a lack of self-awareness, often driven by irrational impulses.
Okay, like a mob mentality.
Yeah. Then there's the life community, Lebensgemeinschaft, marked by genuine co-feeling, a shared identity. And there's this sense that the community itself acts as a subject. He called this representable solidarity.
A feeling of belonging to something larger.
Exactly. And then there's society, Gesellschaft. This is more artificial, consciously formed by individuals to pursue their own interests.
More contractual based on self-interest.
Yeah. And although he saw it as necessary for mature individuals, he thought it was ultimately based on the trust built in those life communities.
Okay, so life communities are the foundation for society.
Right. And finally, there's the collective person in its deepest sense. This is a more evolved form of community characterized by this unrepresentable solidarity.
Unrepresentable solidarity.
Yeah. It's where each member has this fundamental co-responsibility for the well-being of everyone else and the community as a whole.
A deep sense of interconnectedness.
Absolutely.
And within this idea of the collective person, he distinguished between larger communities like the state, culture, and the church.
He did. And he differentiated them by the scope of their responsibility. So the state involves a shared responsibility for all citizens within its borders, focused on law and order. Culture is defined by shared values, beliefs, and practices, often going beyond national boundaries. And the church, for Scheler, was the most expansive form.
Okay, most expansive.
He saw it as a love community, Liebesgemeinschaft, aiming for the spiritual well-being of everyone. And while he recognized these communities are interconnected, he strongly emphasized their autonomy. He argued for a clear separation of church and state, and he also thought cultural life had its own integrity.
So each sphere has its own domain.
Exactly. And the concept of solidarity, it's central to his understanding of community.
Absolutely. How did he define that?
For Scheler, solidarity has 2 main aspects. It's about responsibility for your own actions and co-responsibility for the well-being of others in your community.
So individual responsibility and shared responsibility.
Exactly. And this co-responsibility doesn't negate our individuality. Instead, it makes us ask some tough questions. Like, when someone in my community commits an act of violence, how is that even possible? What role have I played, even indirectly, in creating a world where that can happen?
Wow, those are tough questions.
They are, and he saw these acts of hate and injustice as symptoms of a lack of love within the community.
So love is the answer.
In a way, yes. He believed each of us has a unique role to play in building this kind of loving, responsible community. Host speaker.